Greetings to everyone this morning. My name is Lawrence McDonald. I'm a school teacher in District 6. I teach at Rossay High School, and for many years I've also taught at Hampton High School and Kennebecasis Valley High School. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Atlantic Human Rights Center and involved with several other individuals on the organizing committee of this conference. I'm very pleased to be here in this capacity to introduce to you our next distinguished presenter. Wayne MacKay has had a distinguished career as a university administrator, legal scholar, respected teacher, and constitutional and human rights expert. He has served as president and vice chancellor of Mount Allison University, an advisor to governments, national agencies, and tribunals on Canadian diversity issues, constitutional issues, and civil rights and human rights initiatives. A pioneer in education law, Wayne MacKay conducted a year-long review of inclusive education in New Brunswick and generated a major report in 2005 for the New Brunswick government on reforming the education system in the province. Most recently, he served as chair of the Nova Scotia Task Force on Bullying and Cyberbullying, which released its report in March 2012. As a professor of law for more than 20 years at Dalhousie University's respected faculty of law, Professor MacKay earned a reputation for strong commitment to the teaching and learning experience. His concern for accessibility and equity within the Canadian legal system prompted him to be part of envisioning and implementing the law program for Indigenous Blacks and Micmacs at the law school. He became the law program's first director, and in recognition of his continuing commitment and contribution to diversity initiatives, the Nova Scotia government appointed him Executive Director of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission in 1995. His broad knowledge, background, and distinguished record of achievement have resulted in his high demand for his wise counsel as a legal consultant and change agent. He speaks to diverse audiences on constitutional reform and Charter of Rights issues. His respected opinions are sought by academics, public policy makers, government, community leaders, and the local and national media. Professor MacKay has received numerous awards and special recognition for his achievements, including the W.P. Kennedy Memorial Award for the most distinguished law professor in Canada, and the Walters Tarapolsky Award for achievement in the field of human rights. He was also appointed a Paul Harris Fellow by Rotary International in February 2005 and a member of the Order of Canada in June 2005 and the Queen's Counsel in May 2009. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in the Gaelic vernacular of Alexander Wayne MacKay's ancestral heritage, I would like to extend to him Céilt Míle Fáilte, 100,000 welcomes. Please welcome this distinguished scholar, gentleman, teacher, and human rights advocate, Mr. Wayne MacKay. I present to you.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for the overly kind introduction. There's various other less formal things that Lawrence might have said, but I kind of headed this off when we went for a beer last night. It seemed to work. He gave the official rather than the unofficial version. But one part of the unofficial version that he didn't mention, that at one point, notwithstanding again my young age, I taught Lawrence in education law, and did it wearing Birkenstocks relatively late into the fall. So when the term ended, he presented me with wool socks that his grandmother had knitted. So the other informal parts I'll leave to your imagination. The topic is that I'm going to talk about is I'll get to in a moment, but I want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I want to acknowledge to my left Jenna Lee Wilson, who has worked with me in preparing the slides. I'm basically by nature a low-tech rather than a high-tech teacher, and so PowerPoints is a newer phenomenon, so she's kindly going to move that. Jenna is working with me as an intern, actually, for the summer. Her background is or she's studying in conflict studies at St. Paul's, connected with Ottawa, and decided, I guess they figured if you want to study conflict, they should deal with me. So I'm not sure what that means, but so far it's been pretty positive from my point of view anyway. All right, the topic in general terms that I'm going to address is putting together two things that in a way I think pretty logically go together, and that is the issues of inclusion, which are the core of this conference, and the newer issues that I've been dealing with of bullying and cyberbullying. And as the title suggests, bullying and school violence links, myths, and realities. So the general idea is to link those two and see how they are linked together. And as Lawrence correctly pointed out, my sort of two major entry points to this have been studies. I've done other writing, but the 2005-2006 inclusion study in New Brunswick and the more recent task force in Nova Scotia on bullying and cyberbullying. So anyway, that's the task. Just so you'll kind of have some sense of what's coming, I will probably speak for around 45, maybe a little bit more, because I have a lot of slides there, which will be available just for those who are compulsive about taking notes, and take as many notes as you want, but the slides will be available, and I think there's, just to perhaps forewarn you, I think there's 50-some slides. I'm going to go over them pretty quickly on some of them, but they will be there, and so that's the introduction. So with that, I'll move on to the next one. First of all, obviously on the inclusion point, is defining inclusion. And that was one of the early challenges, and I'm sure in both sessions, the one I chaired on the legal perspectives, and I'm sure on the matter of international panels as well, the question of how you define inclusion is quite important. And in my 2005-2006 report, I particularly like the Manitoba one, which talks about it, as it's set out there, is a way of thinking and acting. It's an approach. That inclusion is not just a placement or a particular program, but it's an attitude and approach, a way of thinking and acting, and it's set out there. When I've presented this in other settings, actually BC tells me that Manitoba actually stole that definition from them, but I'll let BC and Manitoba fight about that. In any event, it's reported in the Manitoba definition, and I think it's a useful starting point. And the last point, which a number of people have commented on, it's about participation, belonging, and interaction. And one cannot underestimate the importance in inclusion and connected with issues of bullying and cyberbullying of belonging, to actually feeling welcomed and belonged in a system. So that's the first point. Next slide. From a summary or a parent kind of summary of my report, the other point that I think is worth emphasizing early on in respect to inclusion is that as I approach it, and I think many at this conference have, inclusion is, in its broadest sense, is not just about including those with disabilities. It obviously includes that, but it's not just that. And I think there's often a misunderstanding that that's exclusively what inclusion is about. Having said it's an approach and a strategy, that it applies to all forms of diversity, whether it's including Aboriginal heritage, whether it's including immigration, whether it's including race, sexual orientation, whatever it might be. And I think that's a really important point. And in a sense, that's a real selling point, if I can use that term, for practicing good inclusion, because it makes a more welcoming setting for all. And one of the points in the report that I made for New Brunswick was that as we seek greater immigration to deal with the declining enrollments, that being able to say that we have a genuinely inclusive education system where culture and religion and all kinds of differences are reasonably accommodated is a real plus. And the second point in this second slide is that, and other people have said this, inclusion is about all. It's not about giving benefits or protection to particular groups. It's about including all people and then benefiting all people. So it's not about particular groups. Next slide. The main point, as I've said for this presentation, is that truly inclusive schools are safer and less violent schools. So that in addition to all the other good and important reasons to have inclusive schools, I think that they are one of the best antidotes to the pervasive problems of bullying and cyberbullying. And I think that's an important point to raise because wrongly to some extent, sometimes people assume that some of the violence is because we have too much diversity in our schools, that we have people with disabilities or emotional problems that are causing problems and so on. The statistics really say that issues of violence and bullying and these kind of things are across all sectors. It's not one particular group, but many groups that are involved in that. Again, and some of these points are summarized there, it's about belonging, and the alienation and feeling that you're excluded or not part of it is often what leads to the inappropriate acting out in terms of violent behavior, bullying, and those kinds of things. And so that the final kind of point on that slide, and I was pleased to hear the Minister of Education in New Brunswick talking about this, that you need proper resources to actually carry out effective inclusion. And a number of people have commented on that. Inclusion as a theory without the resources, human and otherwise, to do it is not effective. So that's also part of being truly inclusive and reducing the potential for violence. Next one. How big's the problem? And this is now drawing on my more recent expertise in relation to bullying and cyberbullying, and what we did as part of that task force in Nova Scotia, which has been, I think, pretty well received in New Brunswick as well, because their new legislation, in fact, better reflects at the moment my report than the Nova Scotia one so far, but that may change. We did two things by way of getting some empirical data. We had an online survey available to parents, students, general public, teachers, and had a response over a 4 or 5 month period of 5,000 responses, which I'm told by department people and generally that that's an unheard of response. And what's even perhaps more surprising, 60% of those responding to this quite extensive online survey, it would take 15, 20 minutes to fill out, so this is not a 5-minute response. 60% of the respondents were young people, which also perhaps speaks to how significantly they see the issue. And the other part we did, we tried to very much involve young people as the people on the front line. So we also had youth focus groups, 35 of them throughout the province. And throughout my slides, you'll see various quotes. The young people in those focus groups often had very insightful comments, both about the nature of the problems of bullying and cyberbullying and ideas about what might be done. So that was kind of our empirical base, apart from hearing all kinds of experts and others as well. Next slide. One agreement that emerged in the online survey certainly was that bullying is a serious problem both within the province of Nova Scotia and locally, and this is actually national and international. Since I've done the report, I was off earlier this week to a Senate committee in Ottawa, and internationally it's a wide issue. And a couple of interesting things about this chart. First of all, in Nova Scotia is a problem in Nova Scotia. Generally, 74% said yes. That's pretty high. The other one is it a problem locally? 53% said yes, which is kind of the typical, yes, it's a problem, but not us. You know, not as much us anyway. Not, yeah, sure, those other people have a problem, but it's not too bad here. I don't know what the real answer in that is, but it is kind of interesting that there's a 21% difference. If you say, is it a problem in the province? 74% say yes. Is it a problem locally? 53% say yes. But on either, that's a very significant number of people that think it's a serious problem, and lots of support that it is. Next one. The youth consultation and focus groups also produced some interesting statistics. They were asked how many were bullied online, and 39% of students said yes. And again, this is a very broad group of people being asked. Interesting and perhaps not surprising breakdown of that. 46% of high school students said yes, 38% of junior high, and 34% of elementary. And a couple of interesting things. I think in general, and these statistics, I mean, this is not one small little sample, I would have thought generally junior high would probably be the highest area for bullying, and may well be, but actually in this little poll, it was actually even a bit higher in senior high. And the other thing that most studies now seem to support, unfortunately, is that elementary schools are catching up quickly. that especially in areas of cyberbullying, as young people get more and more adept at the technology, there's more and more bullying and cyberbullying in elementary schools as well. Another interesting one is reasons for being bullied. We asked what were the major identifiers or target groups for bullies, and the number one in the youth focus groups was sexual orientation. And in some ways, not surprising for those of, I'm sure, heard in the news about high-profile cases of targeting gays and lesbians and suicides and that kind of thing, but that was the number one, quite significantly in theirs. Physical features was the other one. And interestingly, except in the specialized groups, we also had, in addition to general focus groups, race focus groups, Aboriginal, disabled, and so on. And not surprisingly, in the race ones, they said race is large, and I have no doubt it is, but there, that would tended to be covered in the general survey under physical features, whatever that might be. So that's obviously a human rights related category as well. And then thirdly, personal behavior, which again can get into matters like disability if somebody has Tourette's syndrome or whatever it might be. So anyway, those were the three big ones that emerged from the focus groups. One of the insightful comments from the youth focus groups is this one: it really hurts when someone likes a hurtful comment about someone else, so don't do it. Don't help the bad message spread, from a grade 11 student. And one of the things, I don't have time to get into that, but the very interesting issues of the negative underbelly, if you like, as well as the positive aspects of our world of social media and cyberbullying, is that not only are the comments frequently anonymous, but they're quite pervasive. And that it's easy for people to climb on and like the negative comments so that the person who's being victimized by the cyberbullying gets the sense that it's not just one person, but a wide range of people that agree that they're dorks or whatever they're saying online. So it's an interesting reminder that doing something as simple as hitting like to a negative comment can have a really negative impact. And the immediacy, I guess, is another point. Next slide. In terms of reason for being bullied in the online survey, somewhat different in the sense that sexual orientation wasn't as high, and that's kind of interesting. Although 60% of the online were youth, there was a spread there, so there the breakdown, and you could give more than one answer because it doesn't add to 100, but 44% said the way you look. There was a wide agreement on that was the number one. 40% who you hang out with, sort of guilt by association or that sort of thing. Others think that you're weird or different, 39%. And obviously that very much links into human rights issues as well, what's weird or different. And make good grades or poor grades, 24%. So you might be targeted because you did really well in school, or you might be targeted because you did poor, although that was a lower category. And then there were others there as well. On the next slide. A Canadian survey also raised an interesting point. Wendy Craig, who's one of Canada's experts on this, was asking the question, why do so few young people tell adults, their parents or others, that they're being bullied or cyberbullied? And one would have thought, I think, the main reason is the fear that it would get worse, but that's the actual number two reason. The number one reason is fear of being denied access to the internet. And one of the many things we looked at in the task force is the big gap between young and old in how we view the world. And one of the immersions for me is the extent to which the younger generation live in virtual reality as much as they live in actual reality, that nothing would be worse. Bullying or cyberbullying would be a better fate than having no access to social media and the internet. So that was the number one reason they didn't tell adults. So that if parents or teachers' response is, okay, that's it, shut off the computer, you're not using it, not necessarily a good strategy. Another issue that is surprisingly prevalent is the issue of sexting, and probably most of you have heard about that, but sending is a common practice of sending sexually suggestive comments or pictures, but mostly pictures, online, and that's become a very increasingly large issue. Bullet 2 there, Canadian study by the National Campaign to Prevent Teen and Unplanned Pregnancy, 19% of all teen respondents aged 13 to 19 and 22% of teenage girls responded participate in sexting. And there's another statistic, a sort of variation on that, and I think this is right, that something like 1 in 5 young women between 13 and 19 send a nude or semi-nude picture, which is a pretty startling statistic from at least our more cautious adult viewpoint, I think. But anyway, that, and just as a, well, I'll come to that in a moment. So, and then finally, the Pew Research Center says that 15% of teens 12 to 17 reported receiving some kind of sexually suggestive sexting. Makes me, my math isn't very good, but I'm not sure what happened to the other 5 or 4%. Of 19 to 20% are sending and only 15% are receiving. They're out there in cyberspace somewhere, but I'm sure I'm missing something mathematically on that. This is a fairly real problem, and in Sydney, Nova Scotia, around December of last year, there was a big issue around sexting in the school, and one of the things they did there, not necessarily the best response, or maybe it was, is they actually brought in the police and the RCMP to talk to students about the fact that sending nude or semi-nude pictures of people below the age of majority was actually a criminal code offense, that you were trafficking in pornography or child pornography, which was quite shocking to most of the students, that, you know, not only is this not a good thing to be doing and a risky thing in terms of invading your privacy, but in fact you may well be engaging, or would probably be engaging, in trafficking in child pornography. So it sort of makes that point. Next slide. And this is really important in terms of the unique nature of the internet. People become brave on Facebook, they become keyboard warriors. Which is another great comment, I think, that things that people wouldn't do in a face-to-face situation, but when you're anonymous and on the net, you become very bold in what you can do and say. And that's part of the added dimension of cyberbullying. Next slide. There's many negative consequences to bullying and cyberbullying, and suicide is the most extreme, but there's lots of others, all kinds of studies talking about academic reduced performance, school dropout, depression, eating disorder, all kinds of things. But one of the things that actually led to the creation of the task force in Nova Scotia in the first place was 3 very high-profile teen suicides. And in this one, as you can see, and these are pretty startling statistics, actually in Canada, suicide accounts for 24% of all deaths among 15 to 24-year-olds. 24%, I mean, that's pretty astounding. And then if you add the next bullet point, suicide rates are 5 to 7 times higher for Aboriginal youth than non-Aboriginal youth in Canada. Again, making the links between equality issues and these kind of issues. But then Stan Kuchar, who presented to our task force, did make the important point that it's not as simple as saying cyberbullying equals suicide or cyberbullying causes suicide, but it can be a factor in circumstances where people are otherwise vulnerable. And we had presentations from mental health groups saying that it would be, in a sense, dangerous to suggest that, you know, cyberbullying would automatically lead to it, which it doesn't, most do not, but a disturbing number of people do commit suicide. And there was a high-profile case in Ottawa along those lines, and many other places as well. All right, the broad theme, moving on to the next slide, equality and diversity and links to technology. A couple of interesting things there. The idea, or one of the ideas, and there's many, many positive aspects to technology, even though I'm not particularly adept at it, I recognize that we're not going to turn the clock back, and there's huge positives about technology, including access for people with disabilities and so on. In fact, we have lots of demonstrations at this conference. But there's also some negative sides to technology, and one of them is a simple one, the first point, which is really an economic one, that technology costs money, so that instead of helping access inequality, in some ways the advances in technology has further accentuated the divide between those who have money and those who do not, because can they afford access to the iPads and the Facebook, the various laptops and so on, and other kinds of things. So that's the first one. But in May 31st, very recent Globe and Mail article raised another point, and I don't know how well documented this was, but their point, interestingly, some study had shown that internet use by young people was greater in the lower socioeconomic status, for those who had the computers, and perhaps equally concerning, less supervised. And one can think of all kinds of reasons for that. It may be more maybe or maybe not more single parent. I don't know what the situation would be. But that not only are the more vulnerable lower income students more likely to be spending massive amounts of time on the internet, but that more frequently it was on supervised time. So I don't know, as I say, exactly, but it's an interesting point. It's in the May 31st Globe if you're interested in looking at that. Equality and diversity, again, as a connection, supporting vulnerable groups. And occasionally I'll throw in some recommendations from our report, which of course my mandate was Nova Scotia, but I think the principles are more broad than that. And it's recommended the Department of Ed mandate through policy or other means that school boards respond affirmatively to all reasonable student requests to establish a support group. And we put the language a little less antagonistically than in Ontario's Bill 13, where the main issue, and still talked about, is gay-straight alliances. And that's one part, but I think it's broader than that. Any support group, whether it's an abilities group, whether it's a race group, whether it's an Aboriginal group, and this has been followed through. That policy has now gone out, and it's not entirely hypothetical. School boards were apparently refusing, in some cases, not all, but refusing in some cases to set up support groups, particularly gay-straight alliance groups and those kinds of things. So I think it's important to recognize that while not exclusively the targets of bullying, vulnerable groups such as those represented in human rights codes are more likely to be targets of bullying. Recognizing this, the next point on equality and diversity is one of the recommendations was to have a protocol developed between the Human Rights Commission and the Department of Education. That one way that's less expensive and perhaps more efficient and offers more diversity of options is to refer a case in the appropriate setting to a Human Rights Commission, because they can educate, they can mediate, they can engage in restorative approaches. In an extreme case, they can investigate and lay a complaint. But that's something that was pioneered to some extent in Australia. Australia's done a lot of studies on bullying and cyberbullying, and one of their major responses is to have those issues handled through a partnership between schools and Human Rights Commission. So I think that's an interesting thing, and when we get to question period, we might want to comment on. In the next slide, I guess I've already made this point effectively that, or I don't know if I made it effectively, I made it anyway. Marginalized groups are frequently targets, not exclusively, but they are frequently the targets. So we suggest that there might be some review by the Ministry of Justice of whether the legislation, whether it's the Education Act, Human Rights Codes, or others, properly recognize that and provide the protections. Next slide, and this is one of Jenna's and my favorite insights from the grade 4 or 5 student in this case. Other people's feelings should be more important than your own. If everybody thought that way, there wouldn't be any bullying. It's a pretty good point, actually, I think, in that one of the challenges I think that certainly comes out in the problems of bullying and cyberbullying, which are actually symptoms of a larger kind of social problem, I think, is the extent to which people think about their own interests rather than thinking about a broader community or their interests and feelings of others. Because one of the shocking things when you see some of the stuff that people put online, you'd say, well, how could people possibly do this and think this is okay? And I presume in part it's a lack of empathy and a lack of identification with the humanity and feelings of other people. So anyway, I think this is a very insightful comment from a grade 4/5 student. So. Next slide, safe and inclusive schools, social and emotional learning. Now there's a long list there, and as I say, you'll get this, you don't need to look at it now, but one of the things we decided was we were not in a position to identify what are the best preventive interventions for bullying and cyberbullying. And one of the problems we heard is there's so many out there, but rather we did set these criteria to say, here are some of the things you should consider in selecting what is a good intervention to improve the situations of school violence, bullying, or cyberbullying, that it be evidence-based, that you can evaluate it. But one of the important links I want to make here, more social and emotional learning, empathy and respect. That schools are not, and this is very much consistent with inclusion as well, schools are not just about academics and learning the content, but it's learning to be a respectful and responsible citizen. And unfortunately, I'm generalizing here, but I think that there's a certain lack of empathy and respect. And programs like, I think, Roots of Empathy, for example, is one that's interesting, where they bring small babies into class and have people interact with babies to kind of develop empathy. There's all kinds of interesting programs in that regard. But in both the inclusion context and the bullying, cyberbullying context, I would say that we're underserved in our school curriculum in terms of developing empathy, respect, and responsibility. And in fact, we recommend, among other things in the report, digital citizenship. But I'm not sure we even teach citizenship anymore in some of our curriculums, but certainly to the extent that we do or don't. We also need to talk about digital citizenship. What is respectful? What is inappropriate? Taking responsibility for what you say and not being a keyboard warrior, as they said earlier. Next slide. So one of the obvious questions from a practical lawyer, so who should respond and what should they do? And there's a list, it's a wide list. It's a community problem, it needs a community response. Parents, teachers, school administrators, counselors, the justice system, community, internet, social media. And how do we respond? Lots of options, which we'll look at. Whole school and inclusive approach, which is obviously the link to this conference. Proactive interventions, education, progressive discipline, restorative approaches, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, I think is a very positive option because it's frequently, mostly peer-dominated. It's a youth-focused group and tries to reintegrate people back into the community in a way that's obviously without re-victimizing the victim by putting them in a room with the bullier, but there are ways to handle that. And support networks and possibly legal actions. So next slide. Role of communities, as I've already said, and I must keep my eye on the time here. Role of communities, it is a community problem, a wide community problem, so we need to respond at many levels. One of our presenters, a lawyer for school boards from Toronto, in a sense put the issue well. He said, it's a big problem, you have to do everything. So in some ways that's true, or you certainly have to proceed on many fronts. You need to have better education, you need to have better intervention, you need to have legal and policy changes, but you need to be proceeding on many fronts at once to really have an impact, and it's a community issue. Along those lines, we made various recommendations, partnering between police and internet service providers as a kind of more on the sanction side of things, that one of the issues is getting at information. And if I can just take a brief diversion, because it's a particularly troubling and appalling example. I'd mentioned that the Nova Scotia Task Force started because of 3 high-profile teen women's suicides. Recently, it came to light that a resident of Nova Scotia, unfortunately unconnected, but his last name was MacKay, they actually tracked it down, although no relation, went online on Facebook claiming credit by him and his Canada-wide group of 15 people for successfully convincing those 3 young women to commit suicide. And also indicated that this was an ongoing project and that they had other targets that they were working on at the moment, which he wasn't about to reveal. The police were able to track him down, but as of the last I've heard, concluded that there really wasn't anything they could do about that. And to make it even worse, as in this lack of empathy and sort of human respect, that the Facebook entry had been forwarded to the parents of the 3 young women who had committed suicide. So a host of disturbing questions about that, why you would do it and those kind of things. But the practical legal one is surely there must be some legal response for that. And his response to them at the moment, I'll touch a bit more on this later, free speech. I'm not doing anything. I'm just saying things on Facebook. We have free speech in Canada. We have free speech in the United States. So what's wrong with that? Now, I don't agree with that analysis. But surprisingly to me, at the moment, the police feel there's nothing that they can do about that. So that's kind of odd, but we'll come back to that. Next one, role of parents. And I credit Jenna for the great slides on this, but I'm sure anyone with parents sort of recognize this, and students recognize this in 2 ways. One, the lack of getting through to the connected world, but also the technology. We've kind of moved beyond the bullhorn as a means of communication. Anyway, one small recommendation, recognizing that parents have an important role to play here, is that the section in the Nova Scotia Education Act that talks about duties of parents should include a reasonable effort to monitor the online activities of their children, at least to the extent that they detrimentally affect the schools. And I think that's, most of the studies indicate that parents play a very important role in the supervision and those kind of things, but also one other point that came out of the studies quite extensively, adult role models are a huge aspect of bullying and cyberbullying. And I haven't had my defamation lawsuits yet, but maybe it's the defense of truth. But I identify in the report that high-profile media personalities such as Don Cherry in Hockey Night in Canada or Kevin O'Leary on the Dragon's Den may be making bullying models quite popular and positive. And I think that in general, we have to think, obviously, as adults and parents in particular, that students and youth are perceptive enough to know it's what you do, not what you say, that's important. So if you're saying, well, don't bully people, but then you go into the parent-teacher night and you bully the teacher, or you bully the principal, or you bully the mailman, it's the model they're seeing. So my mandate was to deal with bullying and cyberbullying among youth, but it's not unique to youth. Lots of issues of workplace bullying and so on. So anyway, that's another important point. Next slide. What roles do schools play? So in order to provide a safe and inclusive school climate, we need to engage in a proactive and whole school approach to the issues of bullying and cyberbullying. And I think that's the way in which it links very well with good inclusive practices. So, next one. One of the big issues, and this was a large issue when I appeared before the Senate committee earlier this week, is the dilemma that a lot of victims of bullying and their parents face, that when they go to try to get a reaction, everybody wants to pass the buck. Say, well, it's not us because it's taking the schools. That occurred after school hours, or it occurred off school property, or it occurred at the bus stop. And Ontario has already added this to their Education Act, and actually New Brunswick, I think to their credit, have just done this as well, is to define and clarify school board jurisdiction to say that it does apply in cases of misconduct, including bullying and cyberbullying, not just on school premises during school hours, but off premises and after hours if the conduct detrimentally affects the school climate. Doesn't mean that principals have to sort of creep around at night and look in bedrooms of their students to see if they're doing something online, which would raise other legal issues, I think. But it does mean that if there's a detrimental impact on the school climate, that's within your jurisdiction. And I think pretty clearly most studies say that, of course there is. If they're being bullied and it's students and it's happening at home or in some other setting, but then they come back to school, that's going to play out in the school context as well. And one of the interesting studies as well suggests that cyber-bullied victims are also bullied. It's not either or, that mostly it's both at the same time. So I think that larger jurisdiction, and I won't get into the details, but I think that jurisdiction's already there in the case law, both in the U.S. Supreme Court of Tinker in Des Moines for the lawyers among you, but also in lower court cases in Canada. Even if you don't change the legislation, it seems to me that falls within school jurisdiction. That doesn't seem to be the approach many schools are taking. Many schools are saying, no, it's not us. And in fact, one other little quick tangent, I have to be careful of my tangents here, but we had another case, and these do happen elsewhere as well, but I know more about Nova Scotia, where a disabled child actually was at a bus stop, and he was in elementary, I think, and two junior high students talked him into swearing and videotaped him swearing and put it on YouTube. And so, of course, he was not aware that this was not a good thing to do. That was brought to the attention of the school authorities, and they said, well, it's really terrible, but there's nothing we can do. That happened at a bus stop. It's not within our jurisdiction to do anything about that. Both schools, the junior high for the bulliers and the elementary, both said, not our thing. But it seems to me that's too narrow an interpretation of jurisdiction. Another specific thing, next slide, recommendation 32, is that there be a positive duty to report misconduct, including bullying and cyberbullying. And one would think maybe that's obvious, but not so much. So that, and again, some places like Ontario, and I think that's part of the New Brunswick legislation as well, though I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure it is. That's an important thing as well, that there's an obligation not just on teachers, but staff to report it. Then it has to be investigated. You can't just assume that they're guilty, but they're at least reported. Next slide, role of teachers, inclusion in anti-bullying. Teachers are next to parents, probably the major players in many ways, role models, supportive listeners, being proactive, the duty to report, as I just said. But one of the problems that many teachers comment on is lack of skills and resources, and we've heard about that in some of the pre-conference sessions. Teachers don't necessarily feel equipped to respond to these things. So two recommendations. One, that university faculties of education include in their curriculum things like social and emotional learning, mental health literacy, inclusive education, restorative approaches, and anti-bullying strategies. And as much as one would think, well, of course they do that in education faculties, I'm told that's not necessarily the case. And obviously it should be, because you can't very well teach if you have an unruly setting. Second one is that in addition to what they get in the faculties of education, regular in-service that deals with issues like bullying, cyberbullying, inclusion, and so on, so that the ongoing education needs to be provided as well. Roles of the justice system, next slide, and safe and inclusive schools. Fortunately, because I know time is marching on here, is that the inclusion issue was certainly covered extensively in the panel that I chaired on the legal view on education inclusion, and I'm sure was touched on from an international perspective as well. But obviously there is now an important legal component to issues of inclusion. Both under, well, as they list here, Charter, the Education Acts themselves, human rights codes, a lot of human rights cases, Charter of Rights, and Section 15, so that in recent years, and my colleague Diane Potier and Hudi Henteloff and Dr. Snodden in our session talked about the extent to which now legal challenges are really starting to shape the way in which schools practice. And the Moore case from British Columbia will be a big and important decision decided sometime probably in the next 6 months to a year on the extent to which schools can do that. So what I put here is inclusion and the equality imperative. That my position in a number of things I've written, and others as well, is that in order to achieve equality, you do have to have inclusive schools. We then have big debates about what's inclusive and what's effective inclusion. That's a big debate, obviously, and who gets to decide that. But at least on the principle that the constitutional and human rights codes mandate that we must treat people equally, in my view, requires and mandates inclusive education, defined properly. So anyway, that's a large area. And the next slide, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on this, and